The testimonies you are about to hear are not tales of glory, nor heroic scenes recounted with pride. They are fragments torn from hell, voices of soldiers buried alive in burning trenches, of bodies melting into the mud, of men who watched their comrades burn like human torches, helpless to do anything. These memories were not written in campaign diaries, but seared into the flesh and souls of those who survived. They speak of flamethrower tanks spewing liquid fire onto trenches packed with adolescents, of explosions that dismembered men alongside their brothers, of surrender as the only possible human act in the face of unrelenting death. What you are about to hear is not history. It is pain preserved in words, and there's no honor in what they recount, only truth, brutal, filthy, unbearable, like war. The concrete trench. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, as darkness still fell over the dunes of the Normandy coast, German soldier Stefan Heineves was already at his post inside a defensive position known as Tobrook, a small fort half buried in the ground. He was a young veteran wounded in Sicily, now assigned to the Atlantic Wall due to his permanent limp. Like many of the members of the 709th Static Infantry Division, he wasn't there because he was weak, but because of his experience. He knew what it was like to fight the Americans face to face. And in his corner of French soil, he was unknowingly preparing to face the largest amphibious operation in history. That day, he was joined by Sepp, a Belgian volunteer with fervently pro-Nazi views. The two shared watch on the narrow opening of Tobrook, mounting an MG-34 machine gun on a rotating metal shield. The position was part of a network of fortifications organized around a concrete-reinforced beach house known as the Strong House, equipped with anti-tank weapons and machine gun nests that dominated the sea wall. During the night of the 5th to the 6th, the signs that something was approaching became evident. The sky vibrated with the incessant passage of Allied aircraft, many more than usual. From his small opening, Heineves saw the flashes of anti-aircraft searchlights and heard the roar of anti-aircraft defenses firing blindly. Around 1 a.m., his officer arrived on a motorcycle, confirming that enemy paratroopers were falling further south. The field telephone kept them connected, but the orders were vague. "Command is aware." Shortly before dawn, a violent naval bombardment broke the tension. Explosions echoed around the Tobrook and the fortified house. Heineves and Sepp retreated inside the concrete cavity as the earth shook and the concrete cracked. Peering out, he saw the landscape transformed. Wounded cows were running amok, some engulfed in flames, others bleeding to death in the field. One of them, its legs on fire, charged toward him. He shot it down with his MG-34. It was, cruelly ironically, his first shot of the day. In the distance over the sea, he could make out strangely shaped vessels approaching the coast through the mist. Amid the smoke, an American Mustang fighter had crashed in front of the fort. Trapped in the cockpit, its pilot was consumed by fire while his ammunition exploded in a chaotic burst of tracers. Then, an abrupt turn of events. Sepp, who was observing through binoculars, was hit by a direct shot to the throat. Heineves saw the bullet exit the back of his comrade's head, followed by another that shattered his chest. He died instantly, and Stefan opened fire toward the trees from which he believed the shots were coming. A grenade landed nearby, but only slightly wounded him. A camouflage helmet rose from the tall grass. An American was trying to flank him. Heineves shot him down with deadly precision. Soon he saw movement from the beach. German soldiers were trying to reach his position, but they were shot down one by one. One young man was shot in the head, disfiguring his face. Another in the stomach was writhing, screaming. Among them, an officer, a lieutenant, managed to reach Tobrook with an MP-40 submachine gun. In a firm voice, he ordered Heineves to abandon the position. The fortified house had been taken by the Allies and burned with flamethrowers. It was time to retreat to the second line of bunkers, 2 kilometers inland. Loading his still-warm machine gun and escorted by the lieutenant and a handful of men, Heineves retreated inland, limping and firing to cover the advance. Passing 3 dead American soldiers, one of them tried to move. The German officer didn't hesitate and shot him in the head, then did the same to the other 2. A German soldier picked up one of the famous Thompsons, weapons that were seen as valuable but dangerous trophies. Being caught with an enemy weapon could mean immediate execution. They had barely advanced a stretch when 2 soldiers disappeared without a trace. The lieutenant accused them of deserting and surrendering. "But they're not taking prisoners today," he muttered. According to him, The Americans had burned the fort's garrison alive. They advanced through low trees, enveloped in the smoke of the fighting and the constant drone of Allied fighter bombers. The breeze carried with it the stench of burning rubber, fuel, and charred flesh. The pain in his leg increased, but Stefan continued. They then encountered a small group of civilians and forced laborers. There were hundreds of thousands in France, Russians, Poles, men and women, sleeping in stations or under guard, used to build roads, transport materials, and excavate fortifications. One of these prisoners muttered something unintelligible, perhaps a mockery or a plea. The German lieutenant executed him without hesitation, with a shot to the chest. Heineves, covered in blood and dust, didn't stop to look. He continued on his way. Wounded, exhausted, and with his uniform in tatters, he managed to reach the next German fortified position on foot, where he was treated by a paramedic who diagnosed several broken ribs. He and other wounded were sent in a horse-drawn cart to the rear. Traveling alongside them were men barely in human form, soldiers with their hands or eyes torn out, their skin stuck to their burnt uniforms, their faces blackened by fire. Heineves, who could still walk, felt guilty for being among them. But he knew, with the brutal clarity that only war can bestow, that his fate had been the result of chance rather than courage. He was sent to a convalescence center in the southern part of the operational zone, where he was assigned light duties, disassembling and repairing rifles and machine guns that had arrived damaged from the front. Although the work wasn't hard, his mind couldn't rest. During the long sleepless nights, he relived the moment he saw his comrade Sepp being torn to pieces by a bullet, the roar of the thunderbolts descending on the bunkers, the bodies disintegrated by the phosphorus rockets, the column of young SS men turned into a burning grave on wheels. During his recovery, he closely followed the developments on the Normandy front. He knew that what had begun as a limited landing had transformed into a permanent beachhead. The fall of Cherbourg confirmed what many already feared, that the enemy would not be contained. Some soldiers spoke of encircling the Allies, of wearing them down until they were driven out. Most, however, understood that this hope was an illusion. The army they had faced that June 6th was a machine that knew no limits in fuel, ammunition, or air power, a storm of steel, unstoppable. In July, once he had partially recovered, Heineves was reassigned. He no longer fought from a bunker or fired a machine gun on the coast. He was assigned to drive an Opel truck responsible for transporting ammunition and grenades to the front lines. His role was to navigate rearguard routes, deliver cargo, avoid bombings, and above all, survive in a war that was no longer defensive, but openly desperate. That same month, while attempting to evacuate a forward zone, his logistics column was intercepted by American armored vehicles. The group of men accompanying him had only rifles and a few hand grenades. Faced with the Shermans that emerged from the trees, they offered no resistance. They raised their hands and were captured. Heineves would recall that upon arriving at the makeshift prisoner of war camp near the coast, he understood for the first time the extent of enemy power. There, in that camp with more than 2,000 men, there was no distinction between divisions or ranks. Together they were soldiers from the Heer, the Kriegsmarine, tank crews, Luftwaffe technicians, and even some from the SS. No one asked about the other's uniform. They shared only one certainty: Germany had lost control of the air, the sea, and would soon lose control of the land as well. The Americans allowed the prisoners to organize themselves. They distributed internal tasks, maintained minimal discipline, and over time established a kind of functioning community. There was no mistreatment, but neither were there any amenities. Still, many of the Germans, including Heineves, felt a mixture of respect and resignation as they watched the Allies manage their war machine. Everything was efficient. Supplies arrived in endless columns of trucks. Planes crisscrossed the skies day and night. When a vehicle broke down, it wasn't repaired. It was set aside and replaced. The abundance was as insulting as it was revealing. The German prisoners looked at the sealed food containers, the tinned rations flown in from America, the mountains of cigarettes packaged as if they were daily bread, and understood that they were fighting against a colossal industrial power, one that could afford to discard what in Germany cost blood to preserve. Despite this evidence, the spirit of some officers remained unbroken. Rumors of a counter-offensive, of secret weapons, of divisions still holding out spread throughout the camp. But Heineves, like many other privates, had lived too much, seen too much. The images of a burning Tobrook, of the SS soldiers burning alive on the collapsed road, were seared into his memory. The promises of victory no longer held any power over him. The war, for Stefan Heineves, hadn't ended the day he surrendered. It continued every night in every image that played back when he closed his eyes. He had fought to defend the Reich, to prevent the enemy from reaching Germany. But in Normandy he understood that the enemy wasn't just the other army, it was time, it was technology, it was the certainty that what was coming was unstoppable. And when he was finally freed, months later, his war had already changed shape. It was no longer about trenches or flanks, but about remembering, understanding, surviving the memory. The defeat lay not in the surrender of weapons, but in the men who would never sleep soundly again. Machine gunner on Omaha Beach. At the top of the cliffs, west of Vierville, Cape Henrik Naub waited, positioned in one of the so-called resistance positions of the Atlantic Wall. It was an MG-42 machine gun nest, defended by a dozen men living like animals in concrete-reinforced trenches under steel decks, surrounded by barbed wire and mines suspended from the cliffs. From there, the horizon stretched toward a sea that until the morning of June 6, 1944, had been only a latent threat. That day, the abyss was filled with shadows. From shortly after 2 in the morning, the roar of heavy bombers shook the skies. The explosions echoed like omens to the south and east, while the sea, under a full moon filtered by clouds, remained deceptively still. But Nauber and his companions knew something was approaching. They felt it in their stomachs, in the tension of their jaws, in the trembling that none of them wanted to admit. Shortly before dawn, the mist over the water revealed the spectre of an immense fleet. At first, they were isolated silhouettes, but soon they became a grey wall stretching from one end of the visible sea to the other. They weren't ships, they were the final judgment. Without the Luftwaffe overhead, without German ships between them and the invaders, the men of the resistance nest felt the loneliness of defeat before the fighting had even begun. And then the fire fell. From the warships came a barrage of shells that Nauber would never forget. The explosions shook the very rock of the cliff. The concrete vibrated, the edges of the trenches shattered, and the air filled with smoke, earth, blood, and a high-pitched, constant, deafening hum. A comrade tried to flee. He barely poked his head out when a shower of shrapnel cut him in two. Steam from his warm body rose in the cold breeze, filling the trench with the smell of raw flesh. Nauber gritted his teeth. His eyes bled from the pressure. When he opened the steel lid of his trench, he saw the disaster. One of the nearby nests, with its machine gun embedded in a Tobrook bunker, had disappeared. Only human limbs remained amid clouds of dust. And then, suddenly, silence. A dense silence. No birds, no wind, only the screech of twisted steel and the whisper of the sea. At that instant, the landing began. A tide of barges approached slowly, arranged with terrifying precision. The Americans stepped out with deadly calm, descending ramps in single file, clutching each other as if in a training maneuver. Some fell before reaching the water. Others managed to advance until the sea barely reached their chests. There, following strict orders, Naub opened fire. The MG-42 roared like a beast. The recoil was brutal, the drum spinning relentlessly. The high-velocity bullets hit the water with a dry sound as if piercing wet wood. Men fell like puppets with their strings cut. The sea began to turn red, first in isolated patches, then in great clouds of blood and guts. Some soldiers screamed, others simply disappeared beneath the waves. Legs floated, headless torsos flopping in the tide, arms still clutching rifles while the rest of the bodies lay at the bottom. The sound of screams, of water boiling from the impacts, of men drowning, mixed with the continuous fire of the 88mm rifles and the explosions of the naval grenades, was a hellish symphony. With each new landing party, Nauber and his comrades were met with crossfire. Some even touched the sand. A few managed to crawl to the rows of steel hedgehogs where they were hit by snipers or grenades. There were burning bodies, men writhing with their guts exposed, soldiers dragging faceless comrades. Nauber fired until the barrel of his machine gun was red hot. He changed drum after drum with numb hands, covered in dust, blood, and sweat. His ears were ringing, his face was burning. Beside him, the loader was trembling, vomiting, crying. But he didn't stop. The beach was a slaughterhouse. But despite the fire, the mud, the steel, the Americans kept advancing. Like automatons, they climbed out of the barges, stepped on the bodies of their comrades, crawled between the shell craters, and raised their rifles. One by one, the German nests began to fall silent. Allied heavy artillery leveled the positions, rockets ignited the ammunition reserves, and the men began to fall like dominoes. Henrik Nauber, covered in blood that wasn't all his own, kept firing. But deep down, he knew that that dawn in Vierville would never be forgotten. He aimed. He fired. But he wasn't crying for them anymore. He was crying for himself, because he knew he wouldn't make it off that beach alive. Because he knew that even if he did, nothing in the world could erase what he'd just seen. He reloaded. The bayonet hung on his belt, rusted by the salt that had already permeated everything. He bent down and fired once more, straight into the neck of a soldier climbing among the bodies as if advancing on a carpet of meat. The shot was accurate, but it no longer mattered. Every time one fell, 3 more replaced him. This wasn't a battle. It was a human flood. A sergeant ran past from behind, his face split open by a splinter, shouting an order the young man didn't even hear. The drum of the MG-42 had stopped beating. Silence. Corporal Naub was lying on his back, his arm shattered. He was bleeding like a broken fountain. His eyes, open, still stared skyward. He was breathing heavily but didn't speak. The loader had left, abandoning the machine gun when his guts emptied from a shot below the navel. Everything smelled of blood, gunpowder, and urine. The young man aimed again. He fired. His shoulder ached, his face burned, and he could taste metal in his mouth. He looked around. Where his comrades had once been, there were now only dark pools and unrecognizable shapes. The trench was no longer a position. It was a gaping grave. A grenade fell nearby, rolling among the corpses. He saw it bounce like a cursed ball. He threw himself to the side just as it exploded. The world shut down for an instant. He heard nothing. He felt nothing. Just a pressure on his chest and a warm heat running down his back. When he opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was his rifle split in half. Then he noticed he no longer felt his right leg. He tried to move, but something wasn't right. A face appeared over the parapet. He was young. He was an American. His face was black with soot and mud, his eyes glassy, his jaw clenched. The young German raised his arm, not in defense, but as a reflex. But the other man didn't fire. He stared at him. A second, 2, maybe 3. Then he lowered his rifle, looked around, and left, as if he didn't have time to kill someone who was already dying. He crawled as best he could to a small hollow in the earthen wall, not for protection but to stay out of the way. He lay on his side. The sky was blue, bluer than it had been all winter, blue like the sky back home in Bavaria. He thought of his mother. He thought of the trees. He thought of the bicycle he'd left behind. He thought of the letter he never wrote. Distant screams. A flamethrower being ignited. The sound of fire devouring steel. Then a scream that wasn't human. The beach shook. The world shook, but he didn't. A German doctor crawled by, a red cross hanging crookedly around his neck. He looked at his leg and shook his head. He injected him with something that burned. He said something to him, but he couldn't understand. The young man tried to speak, but all that came out was blood. Enemy boots began to pound the edge of the trench. There were many of them. They were heavy. A shadow fell across his face. Another figure, another enemy. This time they aimed at him, the cold barrel of a rifle against his forehead, but they didn't fire. Someone shouted something in English. The soldier lowered his weapon and continued. It was useless to kill him. It was more useful to leave him there as part of the landscape, as a reminder for those who came later. The position had fallen. The 88mm guns were silent. The MGs were muted. The smoke was thick, black, heavy, and on top of all that, the constant roar of Allied engines unloading material, men, ammunition, death. The young man closed his eyes. Pain was rising in his back. His other leg was starting to hurt, though he didn't understand why. He heard a voice. It wasn't real. It was his mother calling him for dinner. It was the sound of the radio in the house, the whinny of a horse, a river, his sister singing, all at the same time, all mixed together. A burst of machine gun fire swept across the sky above him. It didn't hit him. Then something fell on his chest. A blanket. A hand touched his neck. Someone was speaking to him. It wasn't German. It was dirty, coarse English. They were calling his name. Or so he thought. Then he felt himself being lifted up. He screamed, but no one heard him. He lost consciousness. The smell of iodine woke him up. He was on a stretcher, surrounded by shadows speaking in English. One of them looked at him strangely. Another was photographing him. They were cutting his uniform. He felt ashamed, then cold, then nausea, then nothing. He came to in a tent with more wounded. Some were screaming, others were praying. There were Germans, there were Americans, some without arms, others without faces, all the same under the hot canvas. A prisoner. That was him now. A number, a wound, a photo, one more testimony. Norbe's face looking up at the sky, of the eyes of the American soldier who didn't kill him. Finally, an officer with an interpreter sat down next to him. He asked his name, his age, his unit. He answered mechanically. Then the interpreter asked him what he was feeling. The young man stared into space. Weeks passed. They transferred him to a hospital ship. From there to a camp in England. They interrogated him. They ignored him. They read his file. They saw he had no rank, no decorations, just a boy. One more, one less. And one day they let him walk, with a crutch, dragging what was left of his leg. They gave him hot food, clean clothes, and a room with a window that looked out to sea, but he couldn't look at the water. He couldn't see the sea without seeing blood, without hearing the whiz of shells, without thinking about the sound of flesh bursting. Defending Gold Beach, the Sentinel of La Rivière, the story of a German soldier on Gold Beach. Martin Eineg was 20 years old when he was posted to defend the Atlantic Wall in Normandy. He was tall, a keen reader, and although strongly built, he suffered from a chronic lung condition that had initially excluded him from active service. However, his excellent vision made him an asset. After a brief stint as an anti-aircraft gunnery assistant in the Munich area, he was transferred to Western France and assigned to a beach battery near La Rivière, part of the 716th Static Infantry Division. Their position was located in a reinforced concrete bunker armed with two 88mm cannons and an MG-34 machine gun. The position was located on a slope overlooking the beach with an enfiladed firing range covering the coastal strip, the road along the seawall, and the access to the town. The soldiers were housed in a fortified cottage reinforced with sandbags, metal sheets, and embankments from which they could observe the sea. Life at that position, compared to other fronts, was peaceful. Military rations were basic but plentiful thanks to informal trade with the local civilian population, fresh food in exchange for cigarettes, gasoline, or leather. The threat of invasion was an abstract idea. People talked about it, trained for it, but it seemed distant. On the night of June 5, 1944, Eineg and two companions went out to a nearby bar, a place friendly to the Germans. They returned to their quarters under a sky filled with the hum of engines. That same morning, the roar of Allied planes signaled the beginning of D-Day. They awoke to the shouts of their Feldwebel. As they stepped outside, the grey sky was filled with bombers and fighters. They ran down the path leading to the bunker. Upon arrival, Martin was sent directly to the MG-34 position. When he peered through the gun port, what he saw left him speechless. The sea was covered with Allied vessels from the horizon to the shore. The naval bombardment began. Large-caliber shells whizzed past the bunker, exploding behind the defensive line. Rockets fired from the ships impacted directly on the concrete, shaking the structure. One of the explosions hit an officer who had just entered the room. Shrapnel pierced his face and eye. Martin huddled together, covering his ears. The violence was relentless. When the bombardment ceased, a moment of silence gave way to the real battle. The first landing craft were approaching the beach. Some were already burning, having crashed into obstacles or been hit by the 88mm guns. The others were beginning to open their ramps, letting the British soldiers out under heavy fire. Martin fed the MG-34 while the gunner fired precise bursts at the men disembarking. He saw an entire group go down before they reached land. The 88th reached a craft that, engulfed in flames, slid to the shore, trampling soldiers in its path. The beach was a living hell. Troops were trying to advance amid corpses, smoke, and burning vehicles. From the esplanade, British shells were beginning to reach the bunker. A Churchill fired over the sea wall, causing it to collapse. The first Allied men climbed up from there. Martin saw them fall under fire from his MG. Several were shot down, others retreated in panic. At the other end of the beach, the secondary bunker had been silenced by a bazooka or mortar round. The MG-34 began to overheat. The barrel was burning hot and smoke clouded his vision. Martin went to get more ammunition. As he crossed the corridor, he dodged the body of the wounded officer and was ordered to return to his post. Within seconds, a new wave of British soldiers began advancing across the esplanade. Many fell to the machine gun fire, their bodies smoking on the cobblestones. A Sherman appeared through the smoke. The 88th fired, but the ammunition was explosive, not armor-piercing. The tank advanced until it was in front of the bunker. Finally, a shell damaged its track, leaving it exposed. A well-aimed shot set the engine on fire. 2 crew members tried to escape but were hit and fell engulfed in flames. Behind him, another Churchill barreled forward, cutting through the wreckage of the Sherman and firing directly into the 88mm gun's embrasure. The impact destroyed that position. Martin was still at his post by the MG when a British soldier, covered in dust and with bloodshot eyes, threw a grenade into the bunker. He then emptied his Sten's magazine directly through the embrasure. The gunner was hit in the chest and head. Martin, covered by his helmet, received minor hits and managed to escape down the corridor. The bunker's interior was a shambles. Several wounded gunners were trying to crawl through the corridors. The officer who had previously aimed a pistol at him was hit by submachine gun fire as he re-entered the MG room. The ceiling was beginning to collapse. Martin and another soldier fled through the back door toward the sunken walkway. There they joined a group of cooks and aides resisting with rifles and MP-40s. The defense was desperate. One soldier who attempted to surrender was immediately executed by a shot to the head. Then a wave of British infantry stormed the road with fixed bayonets. Brutal hand-to-hand fighting broke out. Martin witnessed stabbings, point-blank shooting, blood on the ground, and screams of agony. Along with a partially blinded comrade, he escaped toward the farm. There he found a new unit, Panzer Grenadiers armed with Panzerfausts and an MG-42. A 75mm Pak cannon was also being deployed. Morale was different. There was experience, clear orders, and confidence. They took up positions on a ridge facing the sea, reinforced with wire and sacks. In the distance, the beach was burning. From the smoke emerged a modified Sherman with a rotating track drum, a mine-clearing vehicle. It detonated explosives as it passed with a hellish roar. 2 more tanks of the same type followed, clearing a corridor about 20 meters wide. The Pak opened fire. The first hit knocked the tank off course, the second destroyed the track, and the third stopped it. The crew attempted to evacuate but were shot down. One of the Panzer Grenadiers fired a Panzerfaust at the second Sherman, but the range was too great. Then British mortars began to fall. The grenades exploded without warning, sending up shrapnel that hit the soldiers stationed there. One explosion seriously wounded the soldier who had accompanied Martin from the bunker. Another, just a few meters away, was hit in the chest, convulsing until he died. The farmhouse took direct hits. The sky was covered in smoke, flames licked at the remains of the defenses, and the sound of enemy engines never ceased. As British fire continued to rake the hillside, there was no chance of medical assistance for the wounded. Soldiers fell where they lay, bleeding to death among the disturbed earth and scattered steel. A Panzer Grenadier wounded in the chest thrashed violently, blood spurting out. Another, hit by shrapnel in the skull, lay with his head split open, brain tissue exposed. Martin Eineg, covered in other people's blood, watched the scene, unable to look away. This wasn't war, it was the end of all recognizable human form. The noise of the approaching mine-busting tanks became unbearable. The chains attached to the rotating rollers struck the ground like metal whips, causing explosions as they triggered buried mines. One of those chains, after being thrown free by the impact of an explosive, fell on 2 German soldiers crouching at the edge of the trench, instantly rendering them unconscious. The German response was desperate. A soldier fired a Panzerfaust at the track drum of a Sherman, but the shell bounced harmlessly. It was at the extreme ends of the front, where the angled firing position allowed other gunners to reach the side of the tank. One of those shots hit the undercarriage, bringing the armored vehicle to a standstill. Smoke began to pour out of the engine vents, and a second shot pierced the turret from below. However, the Sherman's gun remained active. It strafed the German position with frontal fire, raking the line with bursts that kicked up dirt with each impact. The moment of hope faded as the 2 remaining Shermans resumed their advance, ignoring the burning armored vehicle as it burned amidst fuel explosions. One crew member managed to escape the burning vehicle but was immediately shot down by a German MG-42. Martin felt the same pang that had pierced him in the bunker again, a dark feeling of foreboding, as if each shot sealed its own fate. There were only about 12 capable defenders left on the line. The last resort, a Pak 75mm, arrived, pulled by a half-track. Hanomag, whose armor offered minimal protection. The gun crew acted with unusual speed and precision. They managed to hit the drum of the second Sherman, which broke loose and shot down the hill like a murderous tire, scattering metal fragments that hit both German and British positions. The Sherman, however, was still operational. It turned its turret toward the Pak and fired. The first shell narrowly missed, but the second impact was devastating. It hit the gun crew squarely. The blast disintegrated both the gun and the men. Arms, legs, webbing, canteens, and helmets flew through the air like shattered toys. Martin, stunned, felt as if the air had been sucked dry by fire. The farmhouse was burning. The Sherman rained explosive shells on the house and the hill line. Some soldiers talked about surrendering, but the memory of the downed man with his arms raised in the bunker was still fresh. There was no guarantee of mercy. From the sunken path leading to the bunker, gunfire rang out. Soon a small group of screaming British soldiers emerged, armed with bayonets and Thompson submachine guns. They stood barely 20 meters away, their eyes bloodshot, frantic. The MG-42 spun around and fired a lethal burst. 3 British soldiers were blown to bits, literally torn to pieces by the caliber and the short range. Martin fired his rifle, hitting one who was running toward him. Another bullet ricocheted off his helmet, knocking him to the ground. From the ground, still dazed, he watched as another British soldier, wielding a Thompson, swept away the MG-42 crew with a furious burst. The others advanced with fixed bayonets, wounding, slashing, finishing them off. Martin lay motionless, his hands visible. One of the British pointed his Sten at him. Martin held out his hands and shook his head. They kicked the rifle away from him, handcuffed him behind his back and left him lying on his side. The battle was over. Around them the smoke and shouts were replaced by a false calm, filled with engines and orders. A new wave of mine-clearing tanks reached the beach, followed by columns of armored vehicles deploying inland. The farm was completely in flames. The English were massed beside it, ready to advance. A plane then appeared over the bunker area, flying low. He didn't see it, but he heard the roar and the gunfire. Suddenly, several British soldiers fell to the sand. Martin thought they had been mistakenly machine-gunned by their own aircraft. 10 men lay dead. The confusion continued. The German prisoners were taken to a paved square near the sea wall. There, Martin joined other prisoners. He took off his helmet. For the first time in hours, he breathed. He didn't feel humiliated. He had endured to the end. The British, who had been relentless throughout the fighting, now offered water, removed handcuffs, and called for German volunteers to care for the wounded. Some British medics spoke German. The scene was strange, surreal. Minutes before, they had massacred each other. Now they shared water. Martin would remember that sudden transformation as profoundly British, brutality and courtesy flickering on and off like a lamp. The French civilian population, who had been trading with the Germans until the previous day, approached the square to insult the prisoners. Some Germans responded with threats, still convinced that this was just a repeat of the failed assault on Dieppe. But the scale of the landing suggested otherwise. As the morning wore on, more prisoners arrived from the interior. They all agreed on one point: the scale of the assault was immense. Planes continued to cross the sky toward the mainland, and others returned to the sea. The myth of the temporary raid crumbled. The word invasion dominated all others. In the afternoon, a German-speaking British military priest was sent to the group of prisoners to offer spiritual assistance. He was greeted with jeers. Meanwhile, the sound of cannon fire and explosions continued. The sky was still filled with planes, and the earth vibrated under the engines of the tanks. At dusk, the prisoners were taken back to the beach. They were not blindfolded. They were allowed to see their surroundings, and what they saw left them speechless. The sea was now a floating harbor. Armored bulldozers worked on building ramps. The beach was covered with vehicles never seen before: amphibious trucks, tanks with floating screens, gigantic landing craft unloading entire columns of jeeps and armored vehicles. Obstacles had been cleared with surgical precision. Corpses were lined up, covered with tarpaulins. Many Germans crossed themselves as they passed. When Martin Einig was escorted by the British along the beach, he was impressed not only by the display of equipment or the devastation wrought by hours of combat. What astonished him most was what wasn't there: No horse, no mule, no horse-drawn cart. The Allied machinery was entirely motorized. For a German soldier whose division had had stables and a veterinary officer, this was a symbol of the industrial gulf that separated the two sides. Where Germany still relied on horses, the Allies advanced with engines, fuel, and steel chains. The prisoners were put on a landing craft bound for England. On the way, Martin saw the floating remnants of the battle, drifting vessels, bodies swollen by water, columns of lingering smoke. Offshore, they passed beneath a huge British battleship that remained motionless, as if it no longer had a reason to fire. On the bow, a sailor was scrubbing the deck with a broom. It was an absurd domestic sight after the hell they had experienced on the coast. As they sailed away, the battleship's guns began firing again inland. They were the last shots Martin fired. Eineg listened to his war, a war that for him had lasted only a few hours. The prison camp he was assigned to was in Yorkshire. The first few weeks passed with an almost unreal calm. The guards treated the prisoners politely, letters were allowed, and Red Cross inspectors, Swiss and even Brazilian, made periodic visits. But soon the threat ceased to come from the external enemy. Within the camp itself, a group of fanatics, members of the Hitler Youth and former SS men, were plotting to continue the fight. They planned to storm an air base on the east coast. Martin, who had never been a fanatic about anything, refused to participate. This refusal earned him death threats. To escape this internal pressure, he volunteered for a work experience program outside the camp. He was assigned to a vehicle repair shop in a nearby town. Eventually, and as a sign of trust, he was allowed to live outside the camp on his word of good behavior. He was housed by an elderly English woman who treated him like a son. To this day, they write Christmas cards to each other. After the war, Eineg decided to stay in England for 2 more years. He continued repairing vehicles, perfecting his craft, and when he felt the time was right, he returned to Germany. There, he set up a small, discreet and quiet mechanics workshop where he still works. He never set foot in Normandy again. Perhaps one day he will. But for now, he keeps his memories intact, sealed like the walls of that bunker he once defended. Because although he was never more than 20 years old during the war, Martin Eineg aged in a single day. And even today, when he closes his eyes, he hears the screams, sees the smoke, feels the weight of the helmet, and remembers what it was like to witness history, trapped between the steel, the sand, and the silence of those who never returned. The Goliath robot operator. Cornelius Tauber was a young engineer Oberleutnant serving in the 736th Regiment of the German 716th Infantry Division, stationed near Courseulles-sur-Mer from 6:06 early 1944. He had arrived in Normandy from the Russian front, not as a combatant, but as part of the engineering team responsible for building and improving fortifications. In the east, he had learned to build trenches, bunkers, anti-tank ditches and nests of resistance under the worst imaginable conditions. But upon arriving in France, he found himself faced with a different reality. The men there said that life was like a god. Life on the Normandy coast seemed like a joke compared to the Eastern Front. Requisitioned houses offered beds, heating, and clean water. The black market was thriving. Bread was plentiful, wine was affordable, and local farms were generous with Germans in exchange for cigarettes or pieces of leather. Tauber frequently thought of his brother, who was fighting in the east, and every morning he felt guilty thinking about him. He didn't yet know that Normandy would soon become a scene as gruesome as any Ukrainian forest. His work as an engineer consisted of reinforcing civilian buildings, digging trenches with sloping floors that could be armed with explosives, building Tobrook bunkers or coastal artillery bunkers, and in particular implementing a new defensive system, the use of small, explosive-laden remote-controlled vehicles known as Goliaths. These tracked devices, the size of a large wheelbarrow, carried a payload similar to that of a Stuka bomb and could be guided by cables to their target, where they were remotely detonated. Courseulles area, the defensive sector designated B-19, had a specific position for the deployment of these vehicles. The Goliath bunker, as it was called, was camouflaged among concrete rocks painted to resemble part of the coastal landscape. From this position, hidden along the beach line, the small explosive tanks could be launched at Allied armored formations attempting to break out of the sand. The idea was simple. The PAK guns would act as an initial barrier, forcing the tanks to gather in open areas of the beach, where they would then be hit by the Goliaths. On June 6th, Tauber returned to his barracks just after midnight after an inspection of the northern sector. The sky vibrated with the sound of engines. Unlike conventional bombing raids, the sound was lighter, continuous and low. A light drizzle clouded the air. From the courtyard, along with other officers, he watched the silhouettes of planes crossing beneath the clouds. Among them were artillerymen, infantrymen, and engineers. They shared a bottle of cognac, aware that this could be their last peaceful night. The first news arrived via messenger: attacks in the southwest, gliders landing. Still unconfirmed, the magnitude of the operation was unknown, so everyone left for their units. Tauber gathered 10 men from his team. 5 were sent to the defensive positions between the houses. With the other 5, he marched toward the Goliath bunker on the beach. The bunker entrance was protected by a concrete-lined tunnel camouflaged with rocks and vegetation. The main structure was a circular room with a vaulted ceiling. It had 3 Goliaths ready to deploy, plus 5 stored in the tunnel, with fuel to travel up to a kilometer. From a hidden embrasure and a ceiling periscope, they could observe the beach without exposing themselves. At 3 in the morning, the men checked the devices one by one and started the engines to warm them up. The bunker filled with gases. Tension was thick, but no one showed fear. For Tauber, the success or failure of the day depended on preventing the Allies from establishing a beachhead. He knew that if tanks and troops managed to organize on the sand without an effective Luftwaffe and with Allied air superiority, it would be impossible to drive them back. From that sealed concrete capsule facing the sea, without radio or telephone, they could only wait. The outside world was a distant murmur, rumors of paratroopers, of Paris, of landings on other shores. Information was not coming through. The only certain thing was that they, from that blind spot in the sand, would be among the first to see the enemy arrive. From the narrow slit in the bunker, the lieutenant could just make out the blurred silhouettes of the anti-tank obstacles sunk into the sand, still shrouded in salty mist. Around him, the air thickened with the exhaust fumes of the Goliaths firing in the gloom of the shelter. Old men with dull faces and shivering, beardless men shared the space like shipwrecked sailors before a storm. They didn't speak much. Some tried to joke, but the words died on their lips before they could even manage a smile. As the first light of dawn touched the beach, the roar began. At first it was a dull rumble, like an approaching train, then hell. Allied naval artillery blasts ripped into the shoreline with such violence that the bunker's structure vibrated like cardboard. Smoke, sand, and dust covered everything, while shock waves entered through the cracks in the structure and hit the bodies of the crouching men. One cried. Another tried to flee and was beaten to death by a Gefreiter. The lieutenant shouted orders, thinking that he had never felt a bombardment of that magnitude, not even in Italy. It was as if the ships had brought about the end of the world. Then came the aircraft. Fighters with the profile of hurricanes flew low over the position, firing at the flanks, at obstacles, at the machine gun positions. When the bombs stopped for a moment, the whizzing of rockets launched from boats could be heard, drawing lines of fire on the wet sand. Through the smoke, the tanks appeared, amphibious Shermans, surrounded by canvas curtains, inflated like rafts. They were swimming. The lieutenant, an engineer by training, couldn't believe it. How was it possible for those hulks to move on their own in the water? But there they were, advancing. The Goliaths were their trump card. One was sent through the bunker's narrow, armored exit, whirring with its small, absurd engine like a toy in the midst of a cataclysm. But an explosion severed the control cable and the aircraft was stranded. Another was launched and lost in a shell crater before reaching its target. The explosion was violent, yes, but insufficient. The Shermans followed. One burned, but the others fired, climbed the beach, riddled the resistance positions, and then, without warning, the Canadians arrived. The lieutenant didn't see them coming. There were about 20 of them in British uniforms carrying rifles and Thompson machine guns. They passed within meters of the bunker without seeing him. One of his men fired. A Canadian fell and the rest turned, aimed and screamed. One of them was carrying a flamethrower. There was no time to react. The burning tongue of the weapon swept across the entrance to the bunker, flooding it with liquid fire. 2 German soldiers were hit immediately. They burst into flames like human torches, uttering outlandish screams, colliding with the others, sowing chaos. Another stored Goliath was hit by the fire but didn't explode. The lieutenant, his face splattered with burning fuel, ran to the tunnel that led to the upper position. Behind him, flames and smoke chased those who remained. When he reached the top, he bumped head-on into an armed Canadian. The blow from the butt of the rifle blinded him for seconds. Almost instinctively, he fired his pistol twice. The enemy fell. From there, the beach looked like a frenzied anthill. Everything was burning. Everything was collapsing. Hand-to-hand combat had begun. Explosions, machine gun bursts, shouts in German and English. At one point, he fell into a trench and landed on two intertwined corpses, a German and a Canadian who had killed each other. So young they looked like brothers. He crawled away, his face bloodied, until he joined 3 German soldiers. With them, he advanced toward the next defensive point, dodging mortars, mines, and bullets. One was killed by a mine. Another was hit by friendly fire. Only 2 remained. The lieutenant and a young grenadier from the east, faced and dirty, with chapped lips and hands so shaky he couldn't hold the clip of his Kar 98. He didn't speak German, barely understood basic orders, but he followed him, not because he recognized him as an officer, but because he was the only one moving without hesitation. The screams, the torn bodies, the cloud of smoke rising from the burning bunker were gone. The first point of resistance was lost. The Goliath hadn't exploded. The crocodile had done its job. They advanced through a broken trench, crossing a field that looked like an open wound. Torn earth, twisted wire, pieces of men scattered like butcher's waste. They passed a smoking crater where the ammunition from a shattered MG still smoldered. The lieutenant was breathing raggedly. His face was partially burned, the skin peeled away from his left cheekbone like wet parchment. He clutched his MP-40 to his chest like a shipwrecked man clinging to a piece of wood. A group of 5 men saw them coming and signaled from a trench reinforced with earthbags. Inside, there was barely enough room to move. The air smelled of gunpowder, sweat, and concentrated fear. A Feldwebel was in charge of passing ammunition from a makeshift depot. Cartridges, stick grenades, a pair of already armed Panzerfausts. 2 MG-42 machine guns were aimed at the slope leading up from the beach, protected by wet blankets to prevent overheating from putting them out of action. Saarland boy, no more than 17 years old, had his head bandaged with a bloody shirt and glassy eyes. He was muttering something about his mother. No one paid attention to him. Another was crying, but quietly. There was no time for consolation. The lieutenant peered through a gap between the sacks. From there he could see the road leading up from the beach, already pockmarked with craters and the debris of burned-out vehicles. In the distance, smoke mingled with the grey sky. High above, Allied planes buzzed. Many, too many. Planes with wings painted with black and white stripes, gliders, heavy bombers. Some seemed to cast enormous shadows over the apple orchards that had once shaded the farmers. Now those trees were splintered, bare, hanging with broken hulls and mangled bodies. A Sturmpioneer swore. He'd heard the roar. The lieutenant, too, low, gravelly, guttural, the sound of the Churchill crocodile advancing, again. The metal monster's treads crushed the road and crunched the bones left behind. At that instant, a dangling telephone wire caught fire like a wick. Then, a short flash of flame illuminated the ditch. The monster was there. The first volley of liquid fire fell on the front sacks. It didn't hit them directly, but it was enough to penetrate the heat to the core. The first scream came from a machine gunner. He wasn't screaming because he was on fire. He was screaming because he saw the soldier to his right, burning, who had soaked himself with fuel and was thrashing on the ground as if trying to shed his own skin. Another tried to help him, but a second tongue of fire entered through the gap in the parapet and engulfed him as well. The lieutenant crawled backward. The grenadier from the east wasn't so lucky. He stumbled, fell on the first of the wounded, and both of them burst into flames at the same time. They screamed together, one in German, the other in an unknown language, both with red-hot eyes. No one could help them. The trench became a gaping grave. Ammunition exploded, the mud boiled, and men shouted orders that no one listened to anymore. An officer tried to climb the side escape ladder, but a burst of machine gun fire cut him in half. His intestines hung from a wooden post like obscene garlands. Then the lieutenant jumped. He didn't know how. He didn't think about it. He crossed a wall of smoke, dodged a broken barbed wire fence, and tumbled down an embankment to a lower path. His face was burning. He couldn't see fully. He tripped over a body. It was a comrade from the battalion. His jaw was missing. He continued forward on all fours until he found 2 other soldiers fleeing without weapons, without helmets, covered in dirt and dried blood. They didn't say anything to him. They just ran alongside him. They crossed a burning wheat field strewn with charred piles. When they reached a clearing, a burst of fire met them. One of their own fell, shot in the back of the head. They shouted, "German! German, ah!" and raised their hands. From the hedgerow appeared a patrol of their own, camouflaged with branches, armed to the teeth. A Hanomag was waiting under a tree with a team of SS Panzer Grenadiers, calmly, as if the war were happening somewhere else. One of them laughed, another offered water. The lieutenant could barely hold his canteen. A non-commissioned officer, a radio slung over his shoulder, asked him for a report. He barely spoke. He said only 3 words, "Crocodile, all dead." And then, for the first time in hours, he closed his eyes.